I never imagined that after 20 years in the Marines, after watching the worst sides of humanity play out in distant deserts and broken cities, the place where I'd finally feel my finger tightening on a trigger again would be my own front yard in Redstone, Texas, with my kids watching from behind a bedroom window and a deranged HOA president named Gregory Colt standing on my land with a hunting knife, promising in a low, shaking voice that he knew exactly when my children went to school and when my wife was home alone. And as I stared at him under that pale porch light, my mind was looping back through every step that had led us from a simple dream of peace on a 5-acre ranch to a personal war with a man I thought I'd left behind in a dim parking garage years earlier. Back then, I was just back from my final deployment, trying to remember how to sleep without listening for mortar rounds, starting over as head of security at Helios Dynamics, this mid-sized tech company in Austin. And the only real obstacle between me and that job was Gregory, a middle management type with slick hair, an inflated ego, and a resume that read more like fiction than fact. And when I dug deeper, the way any good security man does, I found out he'd padded his credentials and was setting up a pipeline to feed contracts to his brother-in-law's firm. So I reported it. The company dug in, and he was fired on the spot. And as he left that night, he caught me alone in the garage, shadows cutting hard across his face, jabbing a finger into my chest, and whispering that I'd ruined his career and that one day he'd return the favor, which I told myself were just the bitter words of a man who'd been caught. But in the back of my mind, I knew there was something wrong in the way he never blinked, the way the hatred didn't flare up and disappear, but sat there, cold and patient. Years later, my wife Laura and I decided we were done with city noise and screen glow childhoods, that Chloe, 12, and Logan, 10, deserve skies and fields and scraped knees. So we bought my late Uncle Henry's 5-acre ranch on the edge of Redstone, a modest house with a barn and rolling hills. Nothing fancy, but everything we wanted. And when we signed the papers, I noticed one detail that felt like a blessing at the time, that our land sat right next to the Redstone Meadows Association subdivision, but was explicitly excluded from their jurisdiction, a thin line on a plat map that I thought meant freedom from HOA drama and rules about grass length and fence color, not realizing that thin line would soon become a front line. Those first weeks were almost painfully perfect, with Laura preparing for her new job as a local school teacher, the kids exploring every corner of the property, coming back breathless with stories about deer tracks and strange rocks, and me setting up my home office in my uncle's old study, the window framing the hills like a painting. And for the first time since my last deployment, I felt a quiet inside my chest that didn't feel like the uneasy silence before something bad happened, but like actual peace, warm and heavy and real, right up until the certified letter arrived. Thick envelope, official letterhead of the Redstone Meadows Association, and at the bottom a familiar name, Gregory Colt. The letter claimed that due to rezoning, our property now fell under HOA authority, demanded $5,000 in dues plus an integration fee, and listed violations like our barn's paint color, the height of our fence, the unsightly chicken coop I'd built for the kids. And as I read it, my anger rose, not fast and explosive, but slow and steady, because I knew for a fact our deed said the opposite, and I knew exactly who was behind the paper. So I responded the way a reasonable man does. Sent a calm email attaching our deed and the original development plans proving we were outside HOA boundaries. Hit send and told myself that the law would settle it. But 3 days later, a black Escalade rolled into my driveway, engine idling, and Gregory stepped out in a tailored blazer with a gaudy HOA pin on the lapel, like he was some kind of elected ruler. He didn't bother with small talk, just stood at my door, eyes full of that same cold contempt, and told me he'd seen my response, that the board had expanded their territory and that it was all perfectly legal. And when I told him I'd checked with the county and nothing had changed, when I tried to close the door, his hand shot out, grip surprisingly strong, and he leaned in close enough that I could smell his cologne and hear the tremor of rage under the smooth voice as he reminded me that Redstone Meadows was his community, that people who didn't fit and didn't last, and that I'd taken something from him once before, and I knew exactly what he meant. And that was the moment Laura came up behind me, asked if everything was okay, and right then he flipped into a fake charm, introducing himself to her as Greg Colt, the friendly HOA president, welcoming us to the area and assuring her he was sure I'd make the right decision about integrating into the community. And when he walked back to that SUV, leaning into the driver's window and gesturing sharply, I told my wife it was nothing but an overzealous HOA guy. And that lie, that tiny attempt to protect her from worry, would sit on my chest like a stone as everything spiraled. It didn't blow up overnight. It crept in as 100 small wrongs that, taken together, felt like a siege, first with cars rolling slowly past the house, some stopping just a little too long, then with Chloe coming home from school saying certain parents, all from Redstone Meadows, wouldn't let their kids sit with her at lunch because HOA kids don't mix with outsiders, and then with our mailbox half-sawed through one morning, leaning like a broken tooth, my security footage catching a black SUV at 2 a.m., plate obscured, driver's face hidden under a hoodie, and every time I tried to get help, people like Sheriff Dale Riker, a man whose tired eyes and bored tone told me he'd rather be anywhere else, would shrug and suggest teenagers, or that I try to get along with my neighbors, reminding me that the association had been there a long time and that most people chose to comply rather than fight. At school, Principal Janet Cole told Laura that kids can be cruel, and maybe Chloe should try harder to fit in, which made my wife, usually the calmest person in any room, slam her hand on the desk and remind the principal that our daughter didn't need lessons in pleasing bullies. She needed adults willing to protect children under their care. And that was when I realized we weren't just dealing with one vindictive man. We were tangled in a web of people more interested in keeping the peace, with power than standing up for what was right. I hired Rachel Monroe, a property rights attorney with sharp eyes and sharper instincts, and she confirmed what I already knew, that legally the HOA had no authority over our land, that this kind of overreach happened more than people realized, and that the personal grudge made it worse and more dangerous. So she told me to document everything, which I did, from the fake violation notice tape to our door on official-looking letterhead, to the way my security cameras had been deliberately turned away before it appeared, to the anonymous late-night phone call telling me the HOA didn't take no for an answer and that people like me didn't belong in Redstone. We met with neighbors outside the HOA like Carla and Luis Navarro and an elderly man named Harold Green, and heard the same story in different words: bogus fines, missing mail, complaints to animal control, threats whispered in hallways, and hidden behind phrases like community standards. And when Harold, hands tremoring around his coffee cup, told me quietly that after he'd spoken up once, his dog disappeared and he'd never found him, and that if he were me, he'd pay whatever they wanted and keep his head down, I felt that old stubbornness flare in my gut, the same grit that had kept me moving in firefights, because I hadn't spent years defending other people's homes just to hand over mine to a bully in a blazer. We took it to the town council, where I stood in the public comment period and laid out the harassment, the vandalism, the legal facts about our deed, while Gregory, sitting with his board, watched me like I was an entertaining nuisance, then stood up and spun a story about how Redstone Meadows was being threatened by outside elements who refused to follow reasonable rules. And some of the room nodded because fear of losing property values is a powerful drug. And that night, when I woke to the sound of breaking glass and found my truck's windshield shattered, HOA rules spray-painted across the hood and my security cameras blinded with black paint, I knew this wasn't an argument anymore. It was a quiet war. We filed for a restraining order, went to court in front of Judge Leonard Hayes, and while Gregory arrived with a polished lawyer named Thomas Black, talking about community integrity, Rachel arrived with documents, footage, witnesses, and she patiently dismantled the lie, showing that our deed excluded us, that there had been no rezoning, calling Harold and the Navarros to testify about their own harassment. And when Gregory tried to bluff his way past direct questions about boundaries and paperwork, the judge finally said the line that shifted the tide, that intent didn't override recorded documents. And he granted us a temporary restraining order forbidding Gregory and HOA reps from approaching us or contacting my family. Outside the courthouse, Erica Shaw from the Redstone Gazette approached with a recorder, asking for comment, and I hesitated because publicity felt like painting a target on my kids, But Rachel leaned in and reminded me that people like Gregory thrive in the dark, that sunlight, messy and uncomfortable as it can be, is often the only thing that stops them. So we did the interview, focusing on property rights and abuse of power, not on our private life. And when the article came out calling our case a first step in pushing back against HOA overreach, the reaction in Redstone Meadows was explosive. At an emergency HOA meeting, Gregory painted me as a dangerous outsider, convinced 72% of members to approve a 15% dues increase for legal defense. But Evan Blake, the HOA vice president and a meticulous accountant, saw that the numbers didn't add up, started digging, and discovered over $50,000 had vanished in a vague legal expenses. While at the same time, I received an anonymous email warning me that Gregory was working with developers on a commercial project that needed our land, that this wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about serious money. The campaign escalated into a smear operation, with rumors painting me as unstable, violent, even predatory, neighbors pulling their kids away when I walked by, a major client asking my company to remove me from a project over reputation concerns, Laura being called into the principal's office to answer for vague parent worries. And just when the isolation felt suffocating, Pastor Joel Harper stood in his pulpit one Sunday and quietly talked about gossip as a weapon, about how communities destroy themselves when they choose rumors over truth, and hearing him defend us without naming us gave me just enough strength to keep fighting, a strength I desperately needed the night a rock crashed through my children's bedroom window with a note wrapped around it that said, in block letters, "Leave before someone gets hurt." When I walked into that room, glass glittering across the floor like ice, Chloe curled against the corner of her bed, Logan standing barefoot in the hall with tears running down his cheeks, and Laura trying to comfort both of them at once. Every instinct I'd scream for action, but what I did instead was force myself into that slow, deliberate breathing they teach you in the Marines when panic is trying to take over. Because I knew that if I reacted purely on rage, I'd lose, so I called the sheriff, secured the window, reviewed the footage, found nothing but darkness and a vague silhouette, and when Sheriff Riker finally arrived and all but shrugged, suggesting maybe I should reconsider whether holding onto a piece of land was worth all this stress, it was clear that if justice was coming, it wouldn't be riding in a squad car. So we hardened the perimeter, added infrared cameras and motion sensors, enrolled Laura in self-defense, taught the kids what to do if they ever felt followed, and meanwhile, Evan kept digging until he connected HOA funds to Redstone Vista Development LLC, a shell company owned by Gregory, and Olivia Colt, his wife, showed up at our door with trembling hands and a folder full of documents that confirmed everything. The secret development, the bribes, the plan to force us out or drag us into the HOA so he could control the land he needed. We held a secret meeting with Olivia, Evan, Harold, Carla, and Luis, and Martin Cole, the former HOA president, and we agreed that hiding wasn't working, so we organized a community barbecue at our ranch, invited HOA and non-HOA residents, Pastor Harper, and Erica from the Gazette, determined to show people who we really were. And even though Gregory sent out violation notices threatening fines to any HOA member who attended, about 30 people came, some curious, some nervous, and, as the sun went down and plates emptied, we told them the whole story. Evan laid out the numbers, Olivia hinted at what she'd found, and you could see the doubt start to crack the image Gregory had built. He showed up near the end, flanked by loyal board members, publicly threatened Evan for betraying the association, shouted that I was trying to destroy everything he'd built, and for the first time he lost his polished control in front of his own people, his anger spilling out where everyone could see it, and that moment, as ugly as it was, marked the beginning of the end for him, even if he didn't know it yet. Between Evan's evidence, Olivia's documents, and Rachel's legal strategy, the FBI, through Agent Sofia Rivera, opened a formal investigation into Gregory's finances. Councilwoman Renee Porter started pushing HOA oversight reforms, and at a chaotic HOA meeting where he tried to push through a bogus public benefit land grab that would effectively seize my property, Olivia finally stood up, voice shaking but clear, and exposed his development scheme to the room, flipping years of carefully cultivated trust in a matter of minutes, leading to a vote of no confidence and the end of his reign on paper. But you don't corner a man like Gregory without expecting him to lash out, and that's exactly what happened the night my security system pinged me about motion at the end of our driveway. A dark car sitting there with its lights off, the sheriff's office telling me the nearest unit was at least half an hour away. And when I went out to check the property, I found every tire on both our vehicles slashed, rubber hanging in rags. And as I came back toward the house, my flashlight beam caught a figure standing in the yard. It was Gregory, swaying slightly, eyes glassy and wild, holding a long hunting knife that gleamed in the moonlight, the restraining order literally torn into pieces on the ground near his feet, his voice thick but deadly clear as he announced that it was time to end this, that the developers had paid him well, that he couldn't let me ruin the plan, that he knew my kids' schedules and my wife's routines, and, as he stepped closer, knife catching the light, the line between threat and action disappeared, and I felt that old combat calm settle over me. Not because I wanted violence, but because I understood I might not walk away from this if I hesitated. I drew my legally owned handgun, kept it low but ready, ordered him to stop, fired a warning shot into the dirt when he kept advancing, watched him freeze for a heartbeat, and then charge with the knife raised. And in that frozen slice of time, I ran the mental calculus I'd been trained to do, seeing the open field behind him and the house behind me, my family watching, knowing there was nowhere left to retreat to. So I adjusted my aim and fired once, taking him in the leg, dropping him screaming into the grass, disarming him, calling 911 with my free hand and applying a tourniquet with the other, because even when a man has tried to ruin your life, you don't just let him bleed out on your land if you can help it. The rest came in waves. Patrol cars, medics, my own temporary detention while they investigated, Laura's frantic call to Rachel, Olivia telling officers he'd said he was going to solve the Carter problem, Evan and Martin testifying about his threats and fraud, Agent Rivera arriving with a folder full of charges ready to go, and finally the district attorney's decision that my use of force had been justifiable self-defense, followed by Gregory's arrest for trespassing, criminal threats, assault with a deadly weapon, and later federal charges for fraud, bribery, and abuse of authority. After that night, the town shifted. Evan was elected HOA president and pushed through transparency reforms. Boundaries were clarified, so no one could ever claim my land again. Councilwoman Porter got new oversight laws passed. Erica's articles turned Redstone into a case study for HOA abuse and reform, and slowly, people started to see us not as troublemakers, but as a family that had stood up when others were too scared, neighbors coming by to apologize, to bring food, to admit they'd believed lies because it was easier than questioning the man who signed their violation letters. We stayed, not because it was easy, but because leaving would have handed victory to the man now staring through prison bars at a sky he couldn't control, and over time Laura was promoted. Chloe and Logan helped start a reconciliation club at school. Rachel and I wrote a book about property rights and abuse of power. Olivia rebuilt her life and spoke publicly about the danger of blind trust and authority. And 1 year to the day after the shooting, we hosted a Neighbor Day barbecue on our land. Over 100 people showing up, kids running through grass I'd once thought we might lose, a new sign on a strip of our donated property reading Carter Family Park. And as I stood there with my arm around my wife, watching my children laugh without flinching at every sound, I felt something like real peace again, even knowing that somewhere in a prison cell, Gregory Colt was still hating me, still convinced he'd been wronged, but utterly, completely powerless at last. And when people ask me about it now, about the night I shot a man and the months of harassment and the years it took to dig our way back to normal, I always end up asking them the same question in return, because it's the one that still sits with me when the house is quiet and the wind is moving across the fields, in a world where titles and committees and community standards can be used like weapons. How far should someone have to go to defend their home and family? And when that line finally comes right up to your front door, where would you choose to stand?